Good morning and or afternoon to everyone joining us today. Welcome to our webinar, Introduction to Itential's Configuration Manager. Quick intro here. My name is Glenn Gray. I'm the Director of Product Marketing here at Itential, and I am joined by our resident network technology guru, Rich Martin. Say hi, Rich.
Hello, everyone. Hello, Glenn.
Thanks, Rich. I'm glad you're here because you're going to give us a really fantastic demo of the Itential's Configuration Manager today, and we'll get to see a lot of really cool stuff in there. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping points. Everyone on the call will be muted. If you have any questions along the way, just drop them into the questions panel, which you can find under the webinar. We'll do our best to answer questions along the way and cover any remaining ones at the end during our Q&A session. So if we don't get to all the questions during the webinar, we will answer them via email shortly after the webinar. So let's get started. Okay, so for today, just a couple of things we're going to cover again. We're going to recover some ground here for those of you who haven't joined us in the other ones of this series. So we're going to define network compliance. We're going to talk about why it's important. We're going to talk about the configuration compliance journey and the specific parts that we're going to be covering today in Rich's demonstration. We're going to talk about Itential's network automation product stack and how Configuration Manager fits into that. And then we'll jump into the good stuff and let you guys see Rich doing his thing in Itential's Configuration Manager. Okay, so network compliance. You know, we've talked about this a lot in the past and throughout this webinar series. But I think it's a really important point to kind of hone in on here, because this is really the sort of the foundation of a really good automation and orchestration strategy. And when we're talking about network compliance, we could be talking about sort of big C compliance, like HIPAA and other regulations and things like that. But typically what we mean is the adherence to a set of standards that an organization sets for their network. And typically speaking, those standards fall into the three following categories: security, reliability, and performance. So obviously, security being a really big part of this. These are things that you bake into your configuration on individual devices and network services and specific parts and domains of your network to make sure that you've got, access control lists in place and things like that. Reliability, obviously a big concern here too. And what we're really talking about with reliability is we're talking about uptime, right? We want to make sure that the network is up, and then lastly, that the network is performing to spec. And so these are all three kinds of things that get baked into your configurations, both at the individual level, but as Rich will demonstrate today, things that you can enforce across configurations from a single point on things like AWS VPCs, SD-WAN controllers, and so on. So just a real quick recap on network compliance. So Itential's compliance solution is really sort of rooted in this philosophy that compliance and automation, a compliance solution and automation solution really are two parts of a whole. And so that first part of it is really the compliance part of it is really what we're focusing on in this webinar series, and we'll touch on more today in Richard's demonstration. But when we talk about that, what we really mean is inventory management, managing configs, managing devices, everything that you see here on this list. Now, for today's demonstration, we're really going to be talking about everything but the last two. And past episodes of this webinar series, we've talked about validation. We've also even demonstrated some change management with some closed loop automations and some self-service networking. But today we're focusing on that core foundational piece of the product stack, Configuration Manager. And what you'll see as Rich does his demonstration is you'll see our federated device management. You'll see the ability to manage configs both individually and at sort of a broader level, managing devices. And we'll talk about devices that are sort of like legacy devices that you might think of. And we'll also talk about devices or services, network services, things like AWS VPCs, Azure VNets, and so on. Probably most importantly here, what we're going to be talking about is this idea of how do you, once you've created those network standards that we talked about for compliance on your network, how do you enforce those standards? And we do that at Itential through the Configuration Manager by building out golden configurations that you can enforce those standards across all kinds of pretty much any CLI device and all virtual devices, anything that's API driven as well. So Rich will demonstrate that. And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit about auditing and compliance reporting as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Itential's network automation product stack. As I mentioned earlier, philosophically, our approach to network automation and compliance is that these two components, these are two components of an individual solution. And typically what you'll find out in the marketplace is a vendor selling a compliance or a configuration management solution, and another vendor selling an IT orchestration or an end-to-end process automation solution. But we tend to think of these things as necessarily two parts of a whole. And so, I think you could word it like this. Our general philosophy on network automation and compliance is that automation needs to be the foundation of your network compliance strategy, and compliance needs to be the foundation of your higher level automation and orchestration strategy, right? So these are really two sides of the same coin. So I'll just walk through the product stack really quickly, and then we'll talk about Configuration Manager in more detail. But it starts down here on that bottom layer. And for us, that's the Itential Automation Gateway. And this is a part of the stack that basically allows you to connect to and control legacy API or legacy CLI devices, physical devices. It allows you to connect to virtual devices. So in a sense, the automation gateway is really kind of like a controller. And it allows you, I think one of the most important things that it does is it allows you to make that connection with legacy devices that don't have API access or that aren't managed by some sort of a controller. In addition to that, it also allows you to pull in existing automations that you already have maybe built with Python scripts and things like that. So it provides that sort of foundational layer that allows us to integrate with any network system out there. Okay, so the second piece is Configuration Manager, right? And this is what we're going to be covering in more detail today. But primarily, this is the layer where and the component inside our product stack that allows you to create and enforce those golden configurations across CLI, API, and any kind of network device or segment. Then once you've got that, we can start looking at things like the Automation Studio and the Operations Manager. So Automation Studio is really just kind of a canvas, so that allows you to go in and build an automation workflow. We'll probably touch on that a little bit today, but if you're more interested in seeing large-scale automation workflows, then I recommend, if you haven't already, going back and looking at some of our past webinars in this series, where we've demonstrated some fairly large and complex workflows. And then the last layer is Operations Manager, what really gives you a control sort of dashboard view of what's happening with respect to the automations that are running in your organization. But in addition to that, it also does things like it has a job manager in it that allows you to enable things like self-service networking, closed loop automations, and stuff like that on your network as well. So, again, you think about that stack from the bottom to the top. That first piece is integrating with your network systems. The second piece is all about configuration management and compliance, and that's Configuration Manager we'll be talking about today. And then you can start looking at end-to-end process automation and higher level IT orchestration, bringing in things like change management techniques and integrating with products like ServiceNow and others like that. So as promised, today we're going to talk primarily about configuration management. And I think what we're going to do is really just give you a sort of a tour of the product and the UI, and then some of the capabilities that it has. But again, when we go back to that philosophy of ours, which is this idea of compliance and automation being two parts of the same solution, what's really important is the ability to automate compliance. And we do that through golden configurations. We do that through remediating changes automatically, remediating issues automatically as we see them happen in real time, and this idea of compliance reporting. So And then lastly, of course, validating changes. And validating is something that's fairly new, but the idea here is that, prior to putting something into production, but prior to making some sort of network change, you want to validate that it's not going to violate any of your golden configuration rules. So all of these components are a part of Configuration Manager, and we'll be covering those in a little more detail today. All right, so without further ado, I will turn this over to Rich, and we'll start talking about a demo here.
Okay, a great overview, Glenn. I really appreciate that. And so you're right. We're going to dive into the Configuration Manager app, but I'm not going to end there. I do want to show a little bit of the Automation Studio, and I think that's important. But I want to show it in the spotlight of configuration management, because these two things tie together, and having these two things integrated in such a way that we do it in the platform allows for network teams to springboard from getting their network and their entire network infrastructure, whether it's cloud, API, traditional CLI-based devices, in compliance, and then quickly transition into learning the skill set needed to do automation for compliance and beyond that. So I think this is really where we want to show the audience the strength of the platform integration between the two. So we will do a walkthrough of all the things you talked about: inventory management, federated inventory, how we manage configurations within the platform and devices as well, how we created and enforce these golden compliance configuration compliance standards, and then auditing and reporting and some remediation. We'll have a conversation as we go through this, Glenn, because I think getting your perspective on a lot of this, and some of this we've been through in more detail, but getting that walkthrough of all the different features, having some discussions, and then ending up in Automation Studio, where I want to show kind of the direct correlation between everything that we see in Configuration Manager and how that can operate in Automation Studio. So networking teams have they have an opportunity to kind of both get their networks in order with compliance and configuration, and build that gap, build upon the skills gap that they have in automation, and how you can kind of basically do this simultaneously.
That sounds great. Let's get going.
All right. All right. Can I ask the question? Do you see this?
I do.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you talked about the Itential automation platform, that stack, and so when you log in, we have access to all the different areas of that of this solution stack. And the first place we're going to go is under Configuration Manager. Now, I know we've done kind of an overview in some of the previous webinar demos, and we're going to do this here, but we're going to tie this all together in a nice bow at the end. But we always start with Device Manager, which is one of the sections here on the left-hand navigation panel. And so one of the big problems with modern networking today is it's no longer just CLI-based devices. If you look at traditional physical networking devices, there's tons and tons of CLI-based devices. But on top of that, we've grown the network domains with solutions that use like API-based controllers for management. And usually those things are done through dashboards. So if you take a look at something like Meraki or an SD-WAN solution, or even your wireless solution, there's typically a controller or a director, an orchestrator, or it's basically some sort of software brain that can communicate with all those devices, and it becomes part of that solution set. Well, it's important to understand all of your network. So it would have to include that. So all of those Meraki network devices, how do you manage those? How do you get those configurations? How do you ultimately, how do you apply configuration, golden configuration and compliance across those? So the first step is always, how do we federate from all these different sources, including cloud-based network services, into a federated inventory of devices? And that's what we have here. I mean, we've got on the left-hand side devices that are CLI-based, devices that are API-based. One of the ones that we always take a look at it in our demos is a Cisco device, right? A core router. This is a core ATL0 is its name. If I pull this configuration up, or if I click on the device right here, I can see it has an origin point. That origin point is essentially the controller or the service that we are communicating through in the platform, right? So we have integrations into all these network controllers, into the cloud through APIs, or if it's a CLI device, we can use our automation gateway, which was kind of that lower level, the stack, to help our customers onboard all their CLI devices so that they can be managed within the automation platform and specifically within Configuration Manager.
So in this case, we're using IAG to communicate with this device. Is that right?
Correct. Exactly. Okay. So we have multiple instances of IAG, right? So if I were to kind of peruse through more of these, you would see different IAG instances, and that means those devices are essentially being identified, onboarded, and in a sense, it allows us to manage the configuration as if it were a controller for those independent CLI devices.
Actually, Rich, we've got our first question here. If we can just take a second.
Sure.
The question is, are you interacting with this device in real time?
Yes, I am. And that's a great question. So for instance, if I click this load configuration in real time, I am pulling this configuration up. This isn't a backup copy of a configuration that was done, whatever the latest backup is. So this is a real-time configuration, real-time interface with that, pulling that configuration through the Itential Automation Gateway for this particular device. When I get the device status, it's the same thing. It's looking at that in real time. So that's a great question. So this is a particular device. And so once I have it, we can take a look at the configuration and, from here, which is nice. So why is this important? Network teams need tools that can do this. In some cases they have them, right? In other cases, they may not have them, especially in regards to kind of more modern networking, services that are cloud-based. They may not have these capabilities. So to be able to do something like a live backup, right? Manual live backup. And then if I can do a live backup, that means I can have a set of backups historically, which becomes very useful, especially if a device, if we're talking about a CLI device, CLI devices, they stop working for a number of reasons. Trust me, it's never pleasant. And so one of the things we want to take a look at is configurations from the past. So if I can take a look at a past configuration, and compare it to my present configuration, that could be helpful for me to understand if there are any differences, right? So this is a comparison or a diff, and typically you could do these like on the command line, and in this case the configurations are equivalent, so there were no changes here. But this is useful because if things stop working on a network device, from a network engineer's perspective, I think, well, okay, what changed? What changed? Did somebody go into that device, change the configuration, and now some service that was working, some link that was up is now down? And the first thing I want to know is, what are the differences between the two? And so having tools like this in real time, very, very useful for a network practitioner. So having these available in a single place is great. However, not all, especially traditional NCCM tools, have the capability. In fact, I would say none of the traditional NCCM tools have the capability to do things like integrate with API managed devices or services. So in the case of here, what about an Amazon VPC, which is a kind of a foundational network element or network service for the Amazon Cloud platform? Can we, and this is part of having this federated inventory where we can manage at a very basic level things like, for VPCs or any kind of API driven elements. And so we can do the same things. And I know we've talked in the past about, in a previous webinar about, there's some differences with these configurations, but at the end of the day, what we're talking about is how a particular network service or device is defined and configured so to enable certain features, disable certain features, right? And that's all these configurations are. So when we look at something like a cloud service, it doesn't follow the same CLI principles, but the overall configuration, like for instance, we're representing this as a JSON formatted object, but it's still telling us how this particular VPC is configured with things like a gateway, an internet gateway, security group, network ACLs, and those things. And we've showed before how we can do compliance across that. But always the first step is, let's gather all the devices on our network and let's get some foundational management across those. So that includes making backups, and then being able to compare backups. So we go from there, and let's go to the next stop here to device groups. The concept of device groups is pretty straightforward. We have, so one of the easiest ones to understand is, a typical data center network infrastructure. If anybody has deployed a data center network infrastructure, I don't know, in the last 5 or 6 years, they're probably following a very defined template of a leaf spine architecture. And what's interesting about the leaf spine architecture is typically all the spine devices in that part of the network. So we're talking about like a spine is kind of these high capacity Ethernet devices or network devices with lots of Ethernet, lots of high capacity, and they sit at the spine of this layer of the network, and they aggregate a lot of leaf switches to them. They're typically the same kind of device with very, very, very similar configurations to them. And then similarly, the leaf devices, where there are many more leaf devices, and those are the devices that typically connect to, servers or some sort of compute. They are also typically a very defined type of device, like a like kind of device. And so they also share very similar configurations. So it becomes useful to be able to group them together. So let's say I can have some core routers, right? And in this case, I can create a new device group and associate all these like devices into that particular group. And if we can do it for, traditional networking devices, then we should be able to also do it for things like AWS VPC. So now I can select from using my federated inventory on the left, I can add and remove VPC, so I can create a group for demonstration VPCs, right, and group those together. And that becomes important, especially as we transition from configuration manager into the world of automation, where now I can create devices and do things across all of those devices because they are like kinds of devices. They're like each other. They may share the same model and many of the same configurations. So automating across those, being able to group that makes it very easy to build an automation that can iterate through that.
So we have another question here about device groups.
Mm-hmm.
Can you put network devices of different types in a group? So for example, could you put a VPC in a group with an ASA?
You mean like that? Yes,
exactly.
The answer
like
is
that.
yes. You have that flexibility, and that's a great point though. I'm talking about things that are like each other in terms of, especially when I think in terms of automation, right? I want to group like things together. That way, when I automate across them, there's some consistency, in the model and even the configuration and the firmware. But there may be cases where I want to create a group based off of some sort of application or service that may transit across different devices, or different devices that are both traditional on-prem devices, CLI-based on-prem devices, or API managed devices, and the cloud. And I can just as simply do that as well for a reason probably tied to automation, so that I can identify a group and say this group of devices is part of a overall service, right? And then do something with that group. So yeah, that's a great question. You can do that.
We actually have another question about device groups really quickly here. So can a single device be associated with more than one group?
Yes, it can, absolutely. So in the case of like my core routers, we had all of our core routers specifically here in Atlanta here, but I could also create, to the VPC point, like I could create I could create 2 core routers and add a VPC to it as well, and put them together, and then the core routers would be part of multiple groups, because the definition of the group is really just about identifying network elements that have some sort of close association, because you intend to do something with those. Oh, it looks like I'm having a little bit of a network issue. Here we go. Okay, so I could do something like that. I could even save it and then use that as a group in a further way. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later too.
Great.
Good questions. Okay. All right. Device backups. So this is a really easy concept. So I showed you under the devices section the fact that we could make a backup, right? I could click that single button let's go back to like our Cisco devices here. I could go here, I could make this backup. I can create that. So I'm making that backup for core ATL0. And when we make a backup, that's essentially, it ends up in the list of device backups. So I can just filter through. Now that backup is successful, let's see. I can pull up previous backups. And I can actually pull up the backup we just made, right? I just set this description and notes together so we could identify it. And so that's where this is. So again, this is useful. So if I need to go back to a particular day for a particular device, I can go back and find that device backup that was made. And again, this is a tool. Why is this important? Again, your configuration backups, whether it's an API device, a cloud device, a traditional CLI device, for a network practitioner is like the ultimate insurance policy if and when something goes down, right? I have a configuration that tells me exactly how that particular device was configured, especially knowing it was when it was working, and that helps me to troubleshoot what was going on, or in the case of maybe a network router going down, maybe power supply goes out, we do a replacement and boom, I can pop that configuration right on there. And you wouldn't believe, Glenn, how often network teams scramble to find a configuration. And then to find the where is the configuration, who has the configuration, and when was it made? Because if it was made 3 months ago, what changes were made between now and 3 months ago? Because that may not be everything I need to recover that network device and get it back up and running again.
But that raises a question about backups in general. So how do you schedule a device backup?
Oh, this is a great question. I'll tell you what. Let's remind me to answer this question later, because I think we can do some interesting things to answer this question. So make sure you remind me when we get into automation, a little further into automation. I'll try to remember, but you remind me if I forget. Okay, when we get to automation,
relying on my memory and yours. This could go badly.
We'll give it our best shot. But this is a great question, but I think can be best answered when I get to the end of the presentation. All right. Configuration parsers. Okay, this is a new feature, and it ties to a guiding principle that we have at Itential. That's, our customers are going to choose the right tool for the right job. And what that means is, they know their business, they know their requirements, they know the technology they need. And so they are going to buy whatever vendor or solution or adopt some sort of technology that's the right fit for them. And as an automation platform, especially on the network side, we need to be flexible enough so that we can integrate with whatever they choose is best for them. And this is kind of a different way of thinking about things, because in the networking world, a lot of times, if you're buying some sort of management tool, well, you have to, as a customer, you have to be aware of what network devices that management tool supports, right? And when I say how it supports, usually it has to do with, does it understand this vendor's CLI, or even more specifically, does it understand this vendor's version XYZ CLI? Because CLI, even within a vendor, can change even from version to version of the same family of CLI. And so what configuration parsers does is it allows our customers, if there's not support for a particular CLI, and we have a broad support of all of the most well-known CLIs, but that's not an insurance policy of what they could adopt later, or what or CLI could be updated later for even a device they already have, adding new features and functionalities. So the way we approach this, both here and in other parts of our product, is let's give our customers the tools to build a configuration parser or a CLI parser so that if something comes into, into their ecosystem or their environment, like a new CLI or a change to a CLI, they have the tools that they can use to build a parser for this, so that they can continue to work and use the same tool set immediately with this new technology. Because typically what happens is they have to go back to the vendor of that management solution and say, hey, we just picked up this new network device and you don't support it. When can you guys do that? And that's, the amount of time varies, but it's almost never immediate.
Right.
Right. And so, but what does a customer need? They want to be able to leverage these tools for this part of the network immediately. And so this is a method that they do. And again, it's part of our guiding principles. I think we've talked about it in the past too, but in the platform, we have adapters that can integrate with both networking and IT systems and all kinds of other systems through APIs. If an adapter doesn't exist within our pre-built library of adapters, we give the same abilities for our customers to take an API documentation like an Open API or Swagger spec and generate their own integrations into the platform, so that they can immediately start using this new technology in their automation. And so this is the same idea, focused on CLI. So you can take something like, let's just choose, I choose a Juniper device here. So Juniper CLI is completely different from a Cisco CLI. And this allows me to build a rule set. And of course, it's using regular expression. It would take a little bit of time to understand how it all works, and it's in our documentation. But the general idea is this: I can create a parser rule set and then test that within this application. So if I have a Juniper device, I can pull this up again from our federated inventory, and now it's going to pull this configuration in live. And while it's doing that, we can take a look at what we've got over here. We are defining basically the syntax or the grammar that we should expect as part of the configuration parser. And this is important for the golden configuration section, because it has to understand. So for instance, a certain configuration may be tied to maybe a sub configuration of something above it, right? And that's all about grammar and syntax, and every CLI is a little bit different. And so you can build, we've got all of this built out for most of the major CLIs, but if there's something else out there, you can take this as a template and then add to it, so that you can immediately start using that network device within our platform. And so what the process is, you define these things like, what does a white space look like using a regular expression match? What is an open statement block, a closed statement block, terminators, keywords, and comments? That's what's defined here. I pull in the device configuration from a live device, and then I can click here to execute it, and it's going to give me an output in the bottom. And this is where I can verify that my rule set for parsing this is working correctly. So you'll notice like every statement block has a color here, and now I can look and say, are these things correct? So an open statement block should be orange, and it should start with this open curly brace, and that's exactly what we see here. And the associated closed statement block should be in this gray color, and that's exactly what we see here. And so now we can test this out and say, okay, this is working based off of a live configuration, and we can start using that in the golden configuration definitions that we make. So this is a really great feature. Not every customer may use it, but again, it goes with our philosophy, our guiding principles that says we have to be flexible to whatever our customers are going to implement, and kind of future-proof their ability to immediately start using whatever they want inside our platform, whether it's networking, which is the configuration parser applying to CLI, or in Automation Studio, being able to integrate based off of a freely available API spec.
That's great.
All right, let's go into golden configuration. And I know we've spent a lot of time in the past here. And so we're just going to pull up some examples that we've already been through, because we've done everything from building out. Like one of the big questions is, okay, how quickly can I get started building a golden configuration? And that was one of the highlights of one of the earlier webinars. So we could just pull something up. We can start here with the Cisco iOS example. And so what we've talked about before is that when we do a golden configuration template, we take a different approach. What we've seen in the past is that A golden configuration should be applicable to many, many devices, especially if they're of the same type. Especially when in regards to things like security and our compliance standards. So for instance, we can start with a base layer or base level or a base node, and we've named this all routers here, and we can assign a configuration that's relevant to that node. But at the same time, as we create other nodes, like in a tree structure, everything gets inherited from the top down. So everything in all routers should be globally applicable to all of the devices that we want to apply into this golden configuration tree. So we start with things like, hey, let's disable unencrypted management of via HTTP, and that's exactly what this rule does. And let's enable the secure version of HTTP, right? So there's encryption on that, and that's what that second rule does. And that's a great rule that should be globally applicable to any device that gets applied anywhere in this tree. So we want to put that at the very base node or base layer. And then we can create another one. And so logically thinking, if this is for all routers, then we can have a region called the US routers. And now we can add to that configuration. Notice that the all routers was colored in blue. And then we can add to that configuration CLI commands that are relevant, that should be relevant to all routers in the US. And so if you're thinking logically about this, maybe we want all of our syslogs or all of our logging to go to a US device or a US server, right? Or it can even be, further regionalized to US East and US West if we wanted to create another tree, another branch under US. This would be applicable to Europe. So we could, under all routers, we could create, a Europe routers, an EU routers, where the regulations there say you must keep this data within, this particular geographic region. And so being able to have that flexibility in defining these things that are applicable to multiple routers. So it's not a one router at a time kind of scenario. This can be applied to multiple routers. And then as we go down further in the tree, we get to be more and more specific about the configurations. And in this example, we've built out 3 nodes, and the final node is the most specific node. So we're inheriting everything from the all routers in blue. We're also inheriting everything from the US routers because they are applicable to this particular Atlanta router. In this case, the Atlanta router has a very specific configuration in orange that should only be on this particular router, for instance. And so this helps to illustrate how we can build these configurations out. And I think in previous and in the last one, we showed both how you can take a live configuration from the devices tab, edit things in Notepad, but you can also pull a live configuration in from here and edit within the editor. Again, very powerful features, and it allows our customers to build golden configuration templates very, very quickly, like within minutes. We've showed that. Apply them to devices, and then iterate that over time, so that now I can add more and more and more to the all routers section, or I can get very specific into the Atlanta section and add more over time. And maybe you start with low-hanging fruit like these, but then you get into more and more, maybe more complex or critical configuration commands and configuration options as you identify them. And then eventually you're going to be able to get, your network devices into compliance much more quickly, and in a way that doesn't require dozens or hundreds of different configuration files. And so from Atlanta, how do we now assign a device to that? We can add a device. In this case, we've added this router core ATL3 to this tree. So that means when we do a compliance report, we run a compliance check on this, it's going to compare the live config from core ATL3 to this inherited config all the way from the top down. This becomes the full config, and that's what it's compared to. So we can just run a compliance report here, and it'll take a moment. Do we have any questions?
We do. Can devices only be added at this lowest branch, what we call a node, or can they be added sort of at a higher one, like US routers or all routers, for example?
Absolutely right. Yeah, and I failed to mention that, but that's absolutely true. You can do that. And I'll go there really quickly. So under US routers, if we look at the configuration, now we have a good golden configuration template, but it doesn't have anything specific to Atlanta and Chicago. And yes, I can from here add devices. And again, here's my federated inventory. I can add a device here. Oops, sorry. I can go and add Core ATL1 to that, and boom, now its configuration will only be compared to this specific subset because it's not inheriting, it's only inheriting from itself, from anything above it and its own configuration in its position in the tree, but not anything under it like Atlanta or Chicago. Whereas if I associate something here, then it's going to take on the configuration specific to Atlanta as well. And since I managed that device, or we did a compliance check, we can then view the compliance report. It came up as a non-compliant because it has this unencrypted configuration line on it. And then we can also view the historic data for how this was compliant and why this is, or when it was not compliant. And this is a great tool too, because you want to understand, well, ideally everything should be in compliance all the time, right? But that's not always the case. And so if you start to see anomalies like, wow, this thing is drifting out of compliance, well, now that you know, it helps give you a foothold to start to investigate what's going on. Many times, if there's not compliance checks going on, nobody really has an idea of not only whether something is or outside of compliance, but when did it go out of compliance? What was going on that day? And those kind of details. So it's really critical to have these kind of tools for a network practitioner. Excellent. So from here, I can actually remediate this. So I can click down, and if I had multiple lines of like things out of compliance, I could click on each one of them and have them kind of batched up, and then click apply. And now Configuration Manager itself is going through the process of, through the federated inventory, understanding where that device exists. Is it through IAG? Is it through some other controller like NSO or some other methodology, and then making that configuration change so that it goes back into compliance. So that's what's going on in the back end, and that's a form of automation, but it's a form of automation that I had to kick off. And we've shown in previous webinars how you can automate that in Automation Studio.
Right. So while it's not, what you're demonstrating here is not specifically part of an automation workflow that you would show in something like Automation Studio.
Right.
The mere act of remediating by clicking a button is automation in and of itself.
Correct. Yes, but that's not where anybody wants to stop in regards to automation, right?
Right.
You don't stop there, and I think that's the point where we're going to get to. But again, just as a recap, if you can do it with CLI devices, you ought to be able to do it with API managed network devices and or services. And so that's exactly what we've shown before. We could take the golden configuration that are specific to features for a VPC. We can define them in a similar way. They look different because we're using API calls and representing things in formatted objects, a JSON object. But the same concept applies. This is how a very particular feature of a VPC is configured. And just like we can add a device to a tree, we can add an API task, and an API task is a call into AWS in this case to help describe that VPC's configuration, and that gives us kind of that live configuration that we're comparing to. And so the process is very similar, even though one is CLI, one is API, and the configurations look different, but the process itself is very similar in generally in how it works. And so that's what makes this such an amazing tool for network practitioners, is having all of the entire network available to you for the lower level tasks of managing, backing up configurations, looking at things at real time, all the way to building and golden configurations, running compliance, and doing remediation, all within an application like this across the entire network. I mean, that in itself is a differentiator.
Yeah.
But we don't stop there, and that's the intent. The intent is, if you have your configuration and compliance application integrated in a very, very tight way with automation and automation platform, you can start to really see how powerful this could be. And there's always two things going on with the network team. How do we get our network into compliance, right? So that we can automate. Like, I feel more secure if that's the point, but I need to be able to learn to automate, and I don't have time to learn skills, especially around writing code, learning Python, all those kind of things. And so what we want to show, and this is kind of the next section where I want to lead us to, is going from Configuration Manager into Automation Studio. So when I log in, the first step that we took before was Configuration Manager. I want to take us to Automation Studio now, and I want to show you the direct correlation between all the things I just showed you in Configuration Manager and how they operate in Automation Studio. So I'm going to start with a blank slate, basically. So I'm going to pull up this this automation workflow, and there's nothing in it. Okay. I know
it starts and it ends. I like it.
Yeah, that's right. There's always a start and there's always an end. But here's where I want to draw the correlation. Let's go back to devices. Let's go back to in Configuration Manager. Let's click on Core ATL 0. You notice all these details that are popping up? Every one of these elements is now available for us in an automation. And it's a very simple way to engage these things. So what you're looking at here in the start and end is the canvas. But on the right-hand side, I want to show you there are different systems, either their network or IT systems, but very specifically, I want to keep us for a moment in Configuration Manager. So if I open Configuration Manager, you're going to see all of these, basically we call them tasks, but they're API calls that can be used in an automation. So one of the very first things that I showed when you click on a device is it gives us device details, right? So if I scroll down here, and these are all documented, the easiest way, the fastest way to get up to date on what these things are is to read the documentation. But if I go down here, I can find this task called Get Device Details. So if I click on it, it adds it in a drag and drop way onto the canvas. So if I double click on this, just like any CLI command, if I wanted to get a network engineer to kind of understand that, CLI command starts with usually some sort of verb, right? Like show. But you have to tell it what you want to show, right? Like show interface, show config, show this, show that. An API call is similar. It requires some sort of input for it to know what you want to do. So in this case, the description is it's going to give me the detailed information for a device that's onboarded into the system in that federated inventory, and it's asking me for the name of the device. So for us, should be very straightforward. Now let's do 0. And it's a string instead, but this is as simple as it gets, right? So I save this, and now I can create what's called transitions. Basically, this is the linear progression of a particular task. We're starting very simple because we need to help our network brothers and sisters get to the point where they can automate these things. And then if they understand how Configuration Manager runs and how it operates, it becomes the perfect framework for them to understand how to build automations specific to Configuration Manager. So I'll show you what I mean. So I'll save this, and then we can run it from here just as like in a test environment to see how this operates. And so now I'm taking a look at if I visualize it, you can see what's going on. It's completed this particular task. And if I double click it, the input, what it was asking for, what device do you want details on? Core ATL 0, that was the device that was in our federated inventory. What did it respond with? Well, look at this. It responded with all the same information, right, that we got from here. You see that? The origin, IP address, port that it's used to manage it through, all of those things. There's a direct correlation for every one of those features into the Automation Studio. So if I understand something in Configuration Manager, I can now take that understanding as a foundational element to say, where is the task that allows me to get access to that information for that device? So if I can do it for Get Device Details, then we can add on to it. So what was the next thing? If I click on a device, I can load its config, right?
Right. And I haven't forgotten, by the way, that you owe me an answer.
Good. So let's add this to it. So we want that to be the next step. I'll double click it. What is it asking for? Okay, you want to get the config of a device? Which device do you want to get the config for? So I can save it, I can run it. We can view the job. And now it's doing exactly what we were doing before when we clicked that load configuration button. It's doing exactly that same thing now in an automation. And now that it's complete, again, we can take a look at the input. That's what we gave to that API task or call. And this is what we got out of it. We got the configuration exactly the way we got it, but now we've done it in an automation. We don't want our customers to, especially network practitioners who need to start working in the world of automation, being able to take that as a foundation and now to do the things they would normally do in a point and click way, as nice as it is in Configuration Manager, like especially the remediation, ultimately they need to end up here building automations using all of the different features and functionalities of that application, of our Configuration Manager application. And this is a powerful thing for everyone, for the audience to understand. And now I can start building upon these foundational things. So if I can get a configuration, I can also back up a configuration. So we'll do that. And then I'm going to get to, actually, let's go there now. So what was the question again, Glenn?
How do you schedule a device backup?
Okay. So what the person is really asking is, I don't see in your configuration manager the ability to schedule a backup, right? And there's kind of more of a higher level thing going on here. Is in any application, there's always going to be some need for something that doesn't exist, right? Some new feature, and that usually goes back to a feature request. Or to put it a different way, have you ever used an application, Glenn, and said, man, I wish I could do this instead of this, or I wish it would output that instead of that, or I wish I could tie these two features together with a single button click?
Actually, that's never happened to me.
Well, you're the rare bird.
I think it happens about every 5 seconds when I'm using, Word or Excel.
In the world of networking tools and management solutions and things like that, the obvious question always comes up, and maybe it's conditioning, right? We've never been able to do this before. It's like, I want to be able to do this. How do you do that? And so the answer is, you build an automation to do it. And this is a much better way to do it, but it requires two things. A configuration manager, a compliance application that is completely open to automation the way we are, where we're giving you every foundational element of configuration manager to automate. And it requires the ability for your automation solution to understand all of that and leverage all of that and make it easy for a network team to build automations. So these are the two problems that network teams have been facing, right? How do I do compliance across my network? And then how do I also do automation to remove all this backlog? And what we're saying is you can do both of them in a way that's much better than any other separated solution by doing it this way. So let's take that question. How do I schedule a backup configuration? I'd say you build an automation to do it. So literally backup devices right there. And so if I double click into it, it's going to ask me a couple of questions. What is the name of the device you want to back up? And a couple of options here. And if I hover over this, it gives me it's looking for an object. And these are you don't have to write code here, but you do have to understand when it asks for a very specific element or specific variable type, the format that it's expecting it. And this is just JSON. So if somebody learns the format of JSON, they can understand exactly what these things are asking for. So in this case, it needs an object. And so an object just looks like this. And one called description. And we can leave that blank. And then the next field was notes. And that's it. I save it. I run it. We take a look at it. And this is an automation to back up a single device. And now that with a single step, right? And now that this is done within the platform, I can schedule it to run anytime I want. I can schedule it to run, any hourly, daily, weekly, monthly, whatever. Like, we have complete control over how to schedule this automation. But the key is you're building the automation to do the feature that you're asking for. Now, I'm going to take a step beyond this because I think this is really, really cool. But I want to show you, we provided the name of the device and the options that are required, and we got the message that this was successfully backed up using Configuration Manager in an automation. Go ahead. Did you have a question?
Yeah, actually, so I guess the question is, it's not really a question, it's probably more of a comment. I mean, I can see now how the device groups come into play here in the automations, because now what you can do is you can, instead of focusing on a single device, although there may be opportunities or times that you want to do that, you can pull in entire groups that may have hundreds or even thousands of devices and schedule backups all at one time.
And that's exactly what I wanted to do next, because that's not the feature they're really looking for. This is a very limited feature. So if a vendor went back and implemented the ability to back up one device, that would not be a very good feature, right?
Very small networks.
What you're really asking for is, I need flexibility to do backups over a bunch of devices. And exactly right, the group is exactly the perfect container that says all of these devices are of like kind or maybe of like service. I want to back them all up. And so what we can do is we can do a get device. No, it's a get device group by name. So we have a device group like called core ATL, core routers. Yeah, core routers. So if I go back to here, it's going to ask me the group name, simply core routers. I'll change my transitions a little bit. Now, we will have to add in a little bit of logic to this. And the reason why is because when we get the output of get device group by name, it's going to actually give us several bits of information. But the most important thing for this is we want to have that list of devices that are in the group. It's going to give us other things like an ID and like who owns it and things like that. So we want to kind of parse that out. Just parse that array of information out. And so this is where you would get to the logic of the workflow. And this is a very simple thing. And I'll show you real quick what that looks like. So we're going to need two logic elements here. We're going to need the query, and we're going to need, since we have an array or a list of devices, a loop, a for each loop. And so this is how you would fit these together. And again, this is how you go from a simple, one step task to now going, okay, I want to use these foundational elements together. So one of the things I know is we want to query the data that's coming out of the get device groups. It's going to return a lot of information to us. So the query we want is devices, and I'll show that to you in a minute how I know that. And the object that we're going to query comes from the output of that get device group by name task. So the output of that becomes immediately available as the input for this. And I'm asking it, give me the list of devices that are part of the output of that last call. And that's all I have to do there. And the output of that call now goes into the for each loop, because we want to iterate over every one of those devices, right? So we can do a backup on them. And so now I'm going to use the query that we just set up. It's going to have a list of all of those devices in an array. And then we want to iterate over that. Let's see. And so now we can change our transition here to a loop, and this will give us a loop transition. And now I can set this up to, instead of statically defining core ATL 0, actually I want it to use the for each loop and the current name of that device in that for each loop. And we'll walk through this, and I'll show you how this all looks when we troubleshoot or we look at this in the job manager. And that's it. That we just created a feature that now can take a device group, iterate through it, and do a backup using two foundational elements from Config Manager and a little bit of logic.
In minutes, really.
In minutes, and this would have been a feature request to a vendor that may never even happen. And it doesn't stop there. So let's just take a look at this. And as this runs, it'll take a couple of seconds here for it to run. We can visualize it to see how it's going. But the important piece of this here is, again, we don't want it to stop just here. So now this is a useful, like this goes beyond the initial question of how do you schedule a backup. Now I can schedule this to run across multiple devices. And not only that, if I go back to my my automation studio here, there are calls to add new devices to a group. So imagine this, imagine that there's even outside of the configuration management automations, there's an automation that's provisioning a new device, a new core router. And now at the very end of that automation, where that core router is up and running and they've run like post checks to make sure everything's up and working, that next task call could be to add that new core router into this group. And now that these things are, working together in a synergy, right? Because you have the ability to access all of these foundational elements within Configuration Manager and Automation Studio. So now your provisioning automation is adding the correct device into the correct group so that it can always have its backup done with all the other core devices. And this is the power of being able to do this. You're actually creating new features that are relevant to your specific group, your specific team, your specific network, your specific solution set and IT ecosystem. And not only that, now let's zoom back out. We just talked about Configuration Manager. Wouldn't it be nice at the end of this backup if we could add in a notification through MS Teams? You can do that, right? Or if we wanted to go into ServiceNow and update a ticket or create a ticket or close a ticket, boom, you have ServiceNow available to you. Or as part of that, we want to update something in our IPAM system and we use NetBox or we use InfoBlocks. This is where that network team who started with configuration management through Configuration Manager and compliance is now building automations relevant to that, adding new stuff to it, and then expanding beyond that. And that's the power of the platform and the integration.
Well, that is great, Rich. We are well over time here. We had a couple of questions that came in, but what we'll do is for those of you who asked some questions that we didn't get to, we will answer those via email. Thank you for asking the questions. Rich, thanks for the demo. That was great. I'm just going to take us back to our slides really quickly here and just share a couple of things before we move on. So this is just a real quick recap of everything that you saw today in Configuration Manager and beyond. Hey, did you know that you can sign up and try IAP with all the great features that Rich just showed any old time for free? So to do that, just go to itential.com/get-started. And you can get access to the Itential automation platform with mock device data. And when you're ready, you can pull in your own devices and start automating in minutes on your own network. So you can invite colleagues. You can learn through Itential Academy courses that are available to you. So definitely encourage you to try the product for yourself. As you can see from Richard's demonstration, it's quite easy to use, quite easy to get familiar with. So definitely give it a try. Well, one last thing. This was part 6 of a 7-part journey that we're on here in this full webinar series. So join us on Tuesday, December 14th, where we'll talk about a specific customer. We'll actually show you how the rubber hits the road here, and bring in a customer case study. So please join us for that, and thank you for indulging us for going 4 minutes over today. And please again try the product out for yourself, and I'm sure you'll find it very useful. So thanks, Rich, and we'll talk again on December 14th.